Hi, I'm Gabrielle Jackson. I'm the opinion editor at Guardian Australia, and I'm so lucky to be here with Patrice Cullers and Rodney DeVerlis from Black Lives Matter. Welcome.
Thank you.
You guys are in Sydney to receive the Sydney Peace Prize.
Yes.
What does it mean for your work to be recognised with an award like that?
I think it's powerful. I mean, first of all, thank you. Thank you for having us. And it's been really remarkable to go into every single context and folks to honor the people who are of this land. So I just want to open up our conversation by honoring the First Nations people of this current area. And for us, this is the first time the Sydney Peace Prize is awarding a movement. And I think that's really important. It's important context because it's not an individual. We are receiving the prize, but this is on behalf of a global Black movement that has been fighting for centuries for our freedom. And so it's we should all feel like this is a win for all of us.
Yeah, and I think that it's really it's been really great to share space and to be welcomed by Aboriginal folks, Torres Strait Islander and South Sea Islander folks here in this community. I think that in this current climate, in this current context, it is ever more important to recognize the work of Black liberation activists and organizers worldwide. And for us, we say that this prize is for all of us. It's for everyone who's hit the streets under the banner of Black Lives Matter. It's for everyone who's attended an event, who's signed a petition, who's pushed their local politicians for some change, and everyone who's actually thirsty for change as well.
And you went over the weekend to visit an Aboriginal community in Mildura with Indigenous ex-editor Jack Lattimore. Yeah. Was there anything there that you saw that resonated with your experiences in Canada and the USA?
Yes, I mean, I think we were so grateful that folks in Mildura just welcomed us and with open arms, and were very generous with our time. We visited a lot of different spaces that they had created, and they were developing to combat domestic violence, to combat mass criminalization in that area. And I think something that stood out for me was specifically the issue around mass criminalization and mass incarceration, and how similar the rates of locking Black people up are here and in relationship to the United States. And we sat and we had those conversations. But I think the other thing that's really powerful is there's a growing movement here, just like the US, that's combating mass incarceration and combating mass criminalizations and combating deaths in custody.
I think that one of the things that I always would like to do in my work, from Canada, is to highlight the different ways that the Canadian society works to be in denial of anti-Blackness. And I saw a lot of similarities between our two countries. I think that a lot of people can articulate the ways that anti-Black racism manifests in the United States. We often get that information on the first hand, but our countries as well perpetuate anti-Blackness in a variety of different ways. And it was really, really dope, really amazing to be able to hear about people's experiences with incarceration, with housing, with employment, with violence in all different kinds of ways. For people to be so generous with how they were forthcoming with information, and people were really invested in having a global conversation on what can we do to address them. The people of Mildura go through a lot. They are not only attempting to survive, but they're attempting to build communities that are thriving. And it was a perfect way to start our trip.
And I think while you were there, you saw some community-led programs that were happening. Was there anything there that you think you could take back to where you're from? Any lessons or things of interest that you learned?
Yeah. One of the dope things that I found that was interesting was the number of young folks that were actively working within the justice system, and to be the buffer between the formal justice system and their people. Specifically enough, we heard from the Curry courts, folks that were intervening in the court system themselves to say, no, let us actually have conversations on how to do justice with our own communities. And a number of young folks that were not only providing one-on-one advocacy with people who are interacting with the justice system, but working inside, outside, through the system to try to change it. I think that in all of our movements, we've learned and seen the ways that diversity of tactics has worked, that it's not only about taking to the streets and shutting stuff down, but it's also about pushing policy, it's about pushing structural changes inside, and to see folks at such a local context doing that and doing it well and doing it with their community's feedback, their community's buy-in. To see people when we were walking down the streets, we were by a river, and people knew people in community, like people from community would come by and they're like, hey, how's it going? Shake hands. And it really showed me how people were deeply invested in building community, and something that I think we can continue to take back to our communities and learn from.
So for people, after having had that experience, for people who say that Black Lives Matter is irrelevant in Australia, how would you respond?
Am I allowed to curse? I would say that's bullshit. And, wherever Black people are, unfortunately, there's anti-Black racism. There is the global phenomenon of white supremacy and white nationalism, and it permeates our societies across the globe, and it permeates the society in Australia. This was a Black country, and when you jump off the plane in Sydney, you could not tell that. And I think that's a serious problem, because it means that the culture and the people, this country has tried to erase that. And I think what's been powerful is, as Black Lives Matter, our entryway into the country has been to meet with other Black people and to meet with other Indigenous people and have candid conversations about how our countries have tried to continue to colonize us. This is a conversation about colonialism. This is a conversation about anti-Black racism, and we have to be bold in how we have these conversations. So, yeah, I would say it's bullshit. Clearly, Black Lives Matter is global, and it's a global movement, and we're sitting and having conversations with folks who are saying, yes, Black Lives Matter resonates with us deeply.
As a white person sitting here speaking to you, I understand that, there is so much I don't know about the experience of Black lives in Australia and abroad. Is there a role for white people in this, or should we just shut up and listen?
Both.
Yeah. I mean, I think that generally, like, our movements, our work to center Black voices and to center Black life. And part of that, to be able to do that, means allowing Black folks to self-determine how they want to fight for their own freedom. But our work, we recognize the role of allies. We recognize the role of non-Black people in fighting for Black liberation. And one of the most beautiful things that I've seen in this movement is that, in addition to having Black Lives Matter chapters, my chapter, for example, in Toronto, there are subsections and groups and coalitions that are like Asians for Black Lives, that are showing up for racial justice, which is a white ally group. There are people who recognize the role that we all have to play in liberating Black folks, and that it's about taking the leadership from Black folks, getting direction from Black folks, but recognizing that we're all complicit in anti-Blackness. And when we free Black people, everyone gets a bit more free, and it's together that we're able to do it. So I think we say both, because I think that there's an aspect of needing to listen, needing to say, I'm gonna take the lead from you, I'm gonna hear what you think should be the solution to the issues that face you, and I'm gonna be an ally, I'm gonna show up, I'm gonna put my body on the line, and I'm gonna show up and support you however I can.
You've mentioned a couple of times about this being a global movement. How important is that global movement? How important is it for you to come here and connect with local chapters?
It's critical. When we started Black Lives Matter, myself, Alicia, and Opal, it was very intentional that this was not just going to be a domestic conversation, that we weren't talking about civil rights, we were actually talking about human rights. And we were talking about how there is a long legacy of Black people who've been in relationship to each other across the globe. And so some of the most important leadership of the Black liberation movement, Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X, Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, folks from the Black Panther Party, all of those folks have have had a deep investment in the global Black struggle and a deep investment in the global Black family. So for us, this trip to Australia is it's about how we build relationships. It's about how we build this movement and how we understand that our governments are building with each other. Our governments are working with each other. They're working with each other to build new tactics to continue to isolate Black people and Indigenous people. Our governments are working with each other to not sign treaties. They're working with each other to continue to disenfranchise our communities. And so we have to work with each other. And we have to build this movement. And we can't allow isolation or geography to separate us. And so we, we've visited, obviously, Canada, we've been to the United Kingdom, we've been to Palestine, we've been to the continent of Africa, we've been to the Americas, we've been to the Caribbean, and now Australia. And for us, we stand on the shoulders of giants, and we're not the first ones doing this, and we're not going to be the last ones doing this. We are building a foundation for Black people across, the world. Some of my favorite images are of looking at Malcolm in Palestine, and watching some of our most important leaders meeting with other world leaders. That's what we see this as an opportunity to form connections and rebuild this movement.
Absolutely. I think that I couldn't have said it in much better. I think that any time that you look at the ways that anti-Blackness exists at the governmental and institutional level, that there's similarities that exist. So in Canada, we have the residential school system. In here, y'all have the lost and stolen generation. It's the same project. They're actually the same generation of people. It's the same, we share blueprints. We know that police forces train each other, they share resources, they go to conferences just like anybody else, right?
And it's just, I think it's really stark in terms of incarceration, isn't it? Because even some of the prisons are operated by the same companies.
Yes.
Same companies.
Serco, G4S.
G4S, yep.
G4S, they're designed in the same ways with the same things in mind. So ultimately, ourselves as resistors and as freedom fighters and as activists, we have to also be building relations with each other. I also think one of the great things that have happened is that we recognize that Black folks exist everywhere, right? Like there are Black people because of the conditions that force Black people to migrate, that there are Black folks literally everywhere in the globe. So wherever there are Black folks, as Patrice says, unfortunately, there's anti-Black racism. So our work is ever more important. It's ever more important for us to be doing work together and to be sharing resources and sharing tactics in smashing that.
Well, I think we're going to be brave here and try to get some questions from our audience. So we've got a first one here from Geronimo, and who asks, a lot of detractors both in the mainstream media and social media like to say that Black Lives Matter movement doesn't have any relevance in Australia, as we discussed, in contemporary multicultural Australia. How do you respond to this kind of hand-waving?
I mean, I said bullshit earlier. Yeah. I'll just say bullshit again. But I will also say that it's very important that we honor the work that's already happened here. Black Lives Matter is a movement that didn't start because there was new things happening. We started because there was old things happening and nobody was listening to us. And so this is a moment, and we've heard from Indigenous folks here that the government isn't listening. They've been on the ground for centuries. They've been fighting colonization for a very long time, and the government is not signing treaties, is actually sweeping everything under the rug. And so if anything, Black Lives Matter can offer more. What we could offer is the tactics we've used. Once our government stopped listening to us, we started shutting shit down. And I think this is important, the idea of disruption, the idea that there's going to be no business as usual. And part of what happens is governments are like, oh, there goes those pesky Black people again, asking, complaining. And when we started showing up to their offices and we started to shut shit down, when we started, shutting down highways and freeways, this isn't to be sensational. This is because our lives are at stake. Our family members are dying. Our loved ones are sick. Our people are unable to feed themselves because our governments are not protecting us. And so it's been our duty. It's been our duty, and we say this a lot, to fight for freedom. And I think here in the Australian context, we see the same issues happening here. And it's not just the duty of Aboriginal Australians to fight for their lives, but it's the duty of the 97% who are white here to also fight for the lives of Aboriginal people. And I would, really challenge this idea that Australia doesn't need a Black Lives Matter movement, because once again, that would be bullshit.
I don't know if you've been following the news in the last couple of days, but a group of Aboriginal people were asked to recommend how we could recognise Indigenous people, and they came up with this solution and a massive consensus, and then the government said, no, we're not going to do that.
And
that is such an illustration of the government not listening. We asked you to go away, do this, you did it, now we say nah. So what tactics do you think would be a start to protest that?
Similarly, in Canada, we have a culture of consultation. So our governments love to actually consult. We over-consult. There's an issue that happens, people have been saying it for decades, we say, let's consult. We get the consultations, people do a lot of labor, they produce like 100-page report, multiple recommendations that sit on a textbook. So I think it's time to actually take it to the next level and take it to the next step and recognize that whether or not governments will listen to us or will come to the table, we will actually have to force them to the table. That means actually coming up and mobilizing. I think that means galvanizing support and actually getting bodies out on the ground, boots on the ground. I think that's also thinking creatively of ways of moving policy within government that takes a non-traditional lobbying route. When governments aren't here to listen, we need to remind them that actually they have to listen, that it's actually that our rights actually matter, our lives matter, and they require listening. Connecting to the broader question, the first question that was asked as well, we've only been here like 4 days, 4 or 5 days in this country, and have probably heard of like close to, I would say, 100 stories. Like there's been dozens of individual stories. People were saying, I've heard this thing. People come forth and talk to us about what's been happening. So I couldn't imagine having lived here my entire life and not knowing, I think that actually not knowing is an excuse. And as you said, it's bullshit. And it's time for all of our people who live in all of our countries to start listening a bit more attentively and absorbing what people are saying.
We've got another question on Uluru. Where do you start in creating the groundswell of support? What demographic, generational, attitudinal factors do you need to take into account to find a message that resonates with everyone?
It's hard to say. I'm really, really cautious of us coming into a cultural context and telling people what they should do. I can tell you what has worked in the U.S. I could tell you how we've actually challenged the status quo, but I'm not going to tell Australians what to do. And I think that's bad practice. But what we've done stateside, well, first of all, we have to remember the generation who's uprising right now. This is a generation of forgotten people. This is a generation who have witnessed the rise of the police state, the rise of the prison state. This is a generation whose communities have been completely decimated by the war on drugs. This is a generation who watched the social welfare state be ripped up from under them. It's a generation mostly raised by single mothers. And so we see this generation having witnessed not just the high-profile killings of people inside our communities by officers, but this is the generation who've witnessed police raid their homes. This is the generation who've witnessed police take their family members away from them, who've deported their family members. And then this is the generation who have had access to social media to tell our own stories, to proclaim why our Black lives actually matter. And so then you get a generation of very angry, very upset, but also very determined people who actually decide enough is enough. And that decision gets made in a place called Ferguson, Missouri. for us, right? That's our uprising. You know, think about 92 in Los Angeles with Rodney King. That was that generation's uprising. The Ferguson uprising is our generation's uprising, and it becomes the pinnacle in which we then galvanize ourselves, right? To be like, you know what, the old guard's not doing much for us, the old civil rights guard. The government isn't doing shit for us, so what are we going to do for ourselves? And so that's kind of like the recipe that would build what is now a Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, I think that generally, for me, one of the things that we always say is that we fight for all Black lives. And one of the things that I've seen that resonates a lot with our movement is that we actually recognize people's complexities, and we recognize that Black Lives Matter actually has a stake in the women's rights movement. Black Lives Matter has a stake in the LGBT movements, and Black Lives Matter has a stake in the refugee and migrant rights movement. So when we talk about Black Lives Matter, we also are recognizing people's complexities, and people really resonate with recognizing, if I'm a queer Black person, that I'm not only recognizing my Blackness, I'm also recognizing my queerness as well. So when I'm fighting for Black people to not be incarcerated, I also have to fight for Black people's right to love, and for Black people's right to be who they are, for Black people's right for freedom, for economic mobility, etc. So I think that the more specific we can have our movements, and the more broad we can have our movements at the exact same time, the more that they'll be able to resonate with a lot of people. And for us to recognize that we're fighting for all aspects of our Blackness is something that I've seen resonate a lot in our home country.
And another one. How could a Black Lives Matter campaign be started in Australia?
Everybody wants Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't. Once again, I want to let the audience know we are not here to tell people what to do. We're just here to give our experiences around how things have worked in our context. What I do believe is Black Lives Matter can exist everywhere. It can exist in a predominantly white country. It can exist in a predominantly Black country. We see it being used in Brazil, which is 70% Black people. But Black Brazilians have the highest rates of incarceration, highest rates of police violence, all the same issues. And so that's why Black Lives Matter has been an important platform for the people of Brazil. I think, here in Australia, the Black people here have to decide if this is a time and place for Black Lives Matter to start here. And if the Black people here decide that, then we'll be in conversation and figure out how we work with them and be inside of this global Black family.
Amanda asks, is Trump's presidency making the movement stronger?
Oh, God.
I'll let you take Trump.
Yeah.
I'll let you take Trump.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
Let me just tell y'all something, okay? On November 8th, that's when the election was, right? That godforsaken day. Not a lot of us thought that Trump would be elected. I just want to be quite frank. We were naive. It is very important that movements are able to be self-reflective about errors they made. And I think one of our errors of our movement, we were too naive. We did not think that he could become the president for a lot of reasons. One, because he has actually no experience in government. I mean, none. Two, because he is one of the most hateful white supremacists. And three, I don't think we believe that our country would actually put someone in office that could create the sort of damage that he's created. And so, no, it hasn't made it stronger. I think we've decided that we have to situate ourselves differently in this current moment. I don't like to give him that. I don't want to give Trump the idea that he's made us stronger. We were already strong, but I think that we are galvanizing differently because of his presidency.
I think that, whenever I hear questions about Trump, I want to bring people to Canada. We have the opposite of Trump as our leader. Justin Trudeau is well liked across the world. He has great hair. He's like the ideal politician. But under his rise, we've actually seen incredible amounts of anti-Blackness, no actual solutions to incarceration, no actual federal intervention to the lives and the experiences of Black and Indigenous people. So I always want us to take actually steps back to recognize that individual politicians are still a part of a broader system, and that we actually have to be fighting the system as a whole, and recognizing that the rise of leaders like Trump is actually just indicative of the work that we need to do on the community level.
Okay, I think that's a good point to wrap up on. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
an amazing conversation.
Thank you, Facebook.